No matter how cold a case is, there are always investigators, family, and friends searching for new evidence or leads that can help them solve the case. Even though nothing can change what happened in the past, it's always good to finally get answers to these mysteries. Number 5. Almost exactly 40 years after Renee Blackmore disappeared after leaving the military barracks where she was stationed, her cold case may finally have been solved. Renee's mother said she believed everyone but her family and friends had forgotten about her daughter, but investigators at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation reopened her cold case in 2020. Since then, they have found new evidence which allowed them to charge the man they believe to be responsible for Renee's passing. Renee was 20 years old when she vanished without a trace in 1982. She had joined the Army out of high school and had even been the commander of her unit in the Reserve Officers Training Corps while still a senior. This, she believed, was what she was supposed to do with her life. On April 29, 1982, she was last seen alive leaving the barracks at Fort Benning. She was planning to head into the nearby town of Columbus, a perfectly ordinary activity for soldiers who were off duty. But when Renee didn't come back, the alert was raised. Renee's absence was obviously very unlike her, and a civil and military investigation into her disappearance began. Despite the interest, it was a month before the first clues as to what might have happened to her came up. A month after she disappeared, Renee's wallet and sweater were found at the side of the road. It was a few miles away from the army post. The search for Renee refocused in that area, but there was still no sign of her. One day before the 2-month anniversary of her disappearance, Renee's body was found. She'd been left on the side of a logging road near Chattahoochee County. Not a lot of details about the initial investigation have been revealed, though the type of weapon used to end Renee's life was identified. A number of suspects were identified, including then 24-year-old Marcellus McCluster. McCluster lived in Richland at the time of Renee's disappearance, a city less than 40 minutes drive from Fort Benning. The location where Renee's body and belongings were found would have been along the drive between these two locations. At the time, police couldn't find enough evidence to charge anybody with any crime, and Renee's case quickly went cold. It wasn't until investigators reopened the case in 2020 that there seemed to be any hope in the case being solved. New evidence was acquired, and McCluster was charged with taking Renee's life. He's already serving a life sentence for taking the life of another individual a year after Renee was attacked. McCluster is still awaiting trial, but investigators are confident they finally solved this disturbing cold case. Number 4. In 2021, investigators were finally able to close a 45-year-old cold case when Raymond Venuehoven was found guilty of taking the lives of a couple in 1976. Genetic genealogy was used to identify a narrow list of suspects before detectives were able to acquire DNA from Venuehoven from a police survey. His victims were 25-year-old David Schultz and 24-year-old Ellen Matthews. David and Ellen were engaged in 1976. On July 9th, they began what should have been a relaxing camping trip at the McClintock Park in Wisconsin. They thought they were alone at the time. After setting up their campsite, they decided to go on a walk. David left Ellen so he could go to the bathroom before they began. It was then that he was confronted by an attacker. His life was taken with a single bullet. The attacker then chased after Ellen and eventually took her life too. Other campers at the park didn't see the attacks, but they heard it, and later claimed to see a man leaving the area. DNA evidence was collected from the scene of the crime, but there wasn't a lot that could be done with it in 1976. Even with the witness descriptions of the mysterious man, the case went cold, but the crime was so shocking that investigators never left it alone for long. With every advancement in technology, the DNA found at the scene was tested, but no match was ever found. In the end, it was only through genetic genealogy that the criminal was identified. By creating a family tree for the criminal, investigators determined the attacker had to be one of the sons of a Green Bay couple, Venuehoven's parents. In 2019, 2 of his brothers were ruled out after their DNA was tested. Police got Venuehoven's DNA by asking him to fill out a survey and return it in an envelope that needed to be sealed with saliva. After testing the envelope, they finally found their match. Venuehoven went to trial in 2021. The witness descriptions didn't seem to match what he had looked like in the 70s, but the DNA and prosecution arguments were enough to win over the jury. He was handed 2 consecutive life sentences and will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars for this solved case. Number 3. Genetic genealogy finally allowed detectives in San Diego to solve a cold case that had remained a mystery for decades. Mary Scott was found at her San Diego apartment on November 20th, 1969. The previous evening, neighbors had heard screaming, and when Mary didn't show up for her job as a go-go dancer at a nearby club, her friend had gone to make sure she was okay. She found the apartment a mess, the back door kicked in, and Mary's lifeless body in the center. She was only 23 years old at the time. Investigators at the time managed to collect evidence from the crime scene, including DNA which did not belong to Mary or any known individual. But the case quickly became cold. Mary had no known enemies. She had an estranged husband with whom she had 2 children, but he was never a suspect. The children lived with their paternal grandparents at the time of the attack. As the years went on, Mary's family continued to try to get justice for their loved one, but there were no leads to follow. Her parents and most of her siblings eventually passed away, and her youngest sister, Rosalie, was left to carry the torch for her sister. In 2018, when genetic genealogy made the news for the first time, Rosalie contacted authorities and asked for her sister's case to be looked at with new DNA techniques. DNA collected from the scene of the crime was compared to samples in public records. A family tree of the criminal responsible was created, and eventually the DNA led police to John Sipos. Sipos had been living in San Diego at the time of the crime. He had previously been in the Navy, but was dishonorably discharged shortly before the crime. Why he decided to commit such a horrific act was never revealed, but he was eventually found guilty for the crime earlier this year. He's currently 76 years old and faces 7 years to life in prison. Number 2. For decades, detectives in Cleveland have been trying to find a missing person at the heart of one of the most notorious bank robberies the city had ever experienced. It was 1969 when Ted Conrad disappeared into thin air after taking $215,000 from his place of work. In today's money, this haul would have been worth around $1.7 million. He had written a letter saying goodbye to his girlfriend, then left behind his life. At the age of 20, he hadn't put down much in the way of roots, but his parents, brother and sister, would never see him again. The crime took place on a Friday. Conrad had always boasted that he could easily rob the Society National Bank where he worked, and he was obsessed with the film The Thomas Crown Affair, where the main characters commit a daring heist. Conrad's crime was much less dramatic than the story Hollywood portrayed. Towards the end of the day, on July 11th, he told coworkers they could leave early. It was against protocol for anybody to be alone in the bank, but nobody suspected anything, and Conrad was the only person working. At the end of his shift, he left the bank with a paper bag of money from the vault and was never seen again. It wasn't until the following Monday that the crime was even discovered. By that point, Conrad was long gone. It also didn't help that the famous Apollo 11 mission would take place only a week later, so there was no national attention on the crime. Conrad's trail quickly went cold, but a few dedicated investigators kept up the search. Examples of Conrad's handwriting were collected. Tips from as far away as England were followed up on, but there was no luck in solving the case. It wasn't until 2021 that a tip finally turned into something. Detectives were alerted to an obituary for a Mr. Thomas Rendell living in Boston. Rendell was exactly 2 years older than Conrad, and the names of his mother, father, and siblings in the obituary were exactly the same as Conrad's. Detectives looked into Rendell's life more. He had been living in Boston since 1970 and was known as an all-around good guy. He had a wife and daughter and was even friends with a former FBI agent. He'd become a club professional golfer for a time and worked selling cars. At one point, he had to file for bankruptcy. Detectives examined the signature on the paperwork to Conrad's handwriting. They were now convinced they had their man. Detectives went to see Rendell's widow, who confessed her husband had told her about his secret identity just before he succumbed to cancer. None of his friends could believe that the kind, hardworking man they knew had been this notorious bank robber, and it seemed clear this hadn't turned into a profession for him. What had happened to the money remains a mystery. The Rendells had struggled for money, and it didn't seem like Conrad had ever lived an extravagant life. Even without the money, though, the notorious robbery is now a solved case. Number 1. On February 3rd, 1972, Troy Hall made a terrifying discovery when he entered the home of his wife's parents to find a crime that would remain unsolved for 40 years had taken place. 20 minutes earlier, at about 10:30 p.m., he had received a call from Virginia Durham, his wife's mother. She claimed that men had come into her home and were now holding her husband and son in another room. Before Troy could respond, the line went dead. He would later recall thinking this was some strange practical joke, but decided to go check in on the Durhams. A snowstorm had hit the Boone area that evening, and getting to the house wasn't easy. In the end, Troy had to enlist the help of a neighbor to drive him to the residence. When he got there, he discovered Virginia, her husband Bryce, and their son Bobby had all had their lives taken. They were collected together in the bathtub with the water still running. The phone line had been cut and the house was in a state of disrepair. Troy contacted police and an investigation began. It was obvious from the start that this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. While a silver plate and some other items had been stolen, they were all found not long after in the Durham's car, which was found just a few hours later in a ditch a mile down the road. The house had been ransacked, with clothing pulled out of drawers and furniture pushed around. Eerily, there was a partly eaten roast chicken on the table, and glasses of soft drinks the Durhams had been drinking when they were disturbed had been left untouched in the living room. Why anyone would want to hurt the Durhams in such a vicious way was a mystery. Bryce was an automobile dealer, and Bobby was a student. As far as anyone knew, nobody in the family had any enemies who would do something like this. The case went cold, and it was only by coincidence that a clue was discovered that would finally solve the mystery. In 2019, Shane Burt was working with detectives in Georgia on a book about crimes that had taken place in the state. His father, Billy Burt, had been a member of the so-called Dixie Mafia, a loose confederation of criminals that committed violent crimes. Burt and 3 associates had already been found guilty in a similar case to the Durhams, and Burt passed away behind bars. Shane remembered a story his father had told him about taking the lives of 3 people in the North Carolina mountains during a snowstorm. According to his father, they had almost been caught. When Shane told the story, detectives realized this could be an unsolved case. They contacted authorities in North Carolina, who recalled the Durham case. Only one of the group was still alive at this point. Wayne Davis was interviewed by police in prison and admitted that he and Burt, along with Bobby Gaddis and Charles Reed, had been responsible for taking the Durhams' lives. They'd been hired for the job, though who hired them has never been uncovered. Davis claimed he had only acted as the getaway driver while the 3 other criminals did the job. Further interviews and evidence collected from the scene matched up, and detectives concluded Davis had been telling the truth. More than 50 years later, the case has finally been solved. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.